Damian Collins.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I would also like to rise in support of the trade agreement that's been reached with Japan and congratulate the Minister and the Secretary of State on their efforts in securing this very important deal. I would also say, in terms of scrutiny of the process, that I've been very grateful for the fact that the Minister's door has always been open to my questions, particularly about digital and data policy relating to trade agreements, both this agreement and other agreements that are currently being negotiated. And I noticed as well that he offered last week to write to me with a sort of detailed note setting out the differences in the this trade agreement with Japan versus the EU-Japan trade agreement in terms of data and digital policy. The government has been very clear that this is an enhanced deal. I welcome anything that increases the scope for digital trade in this country, because it's incredibly important to our future growth. These are industries of the future, and the UK is a world-leading nation. But I do want to note today, because I think it's important for this agreement and other agreements as well, that the scrutiny of data and digital policy as it's concluded in trade agreements. I think it would be worthwhile to have an opportunity to scrutinise reports from the Information Commissioner on digital agreements, because the Information Commissioner is responsible for the enforcement of our data protection rights. I note that the government says that there are high levels of data protection in this agreement, but obviously what this agreement means is UK data can be processed by data processors in Japan rather than having to be done here. We know, of course, as well that Japan has a data agreement with the US, which allows free flow of data between Japan and the US. So people will naturally raise questions to say, well, does that mean that UK citizens' data could end up via Japan being processed in the US outside of UK data protection laws? Now, I know that's not what the government wants or what the Minister wants, and I'm sure there are safeguards in there to make sure that can't happen. But nevertheless, these are natural concerns that people raise, because the enforcement powers of the ICO to take action against a company that was processing UK data in America, having routed it through Japan in breach of the agreement and our laws, it could be very difficult to take enforcement action against them. So it's perfectly right, I think, that people ask these questions. And I certainly think the ICO could have a role in allaying fears and concerns about that. And the reason I think it's important in the context of other trade agreements is that we know that the big technology companies in particular, through their trade bodies, are actively lobbying for trade agreements to be used to lock in more liberalisation of data policy and the way data is handled and processed around the world. In America, they have lobbied successfully for the US-Japan trade agreement and the US-Canada-Mexico trade agreements to abide by the US law, the Section 230 provisions, which give immunity for tech companies and how they process and handle content. That is contrary to the rules and regulations we have here, and I know I've discussed this with the Minister many times. It's not something that I would want to see in a UK-US trade agreement. Now, if the House said, actually, we would rather have data protection laws that are more like America than the EU, that's a matter for the House to decide and legislation to be passed to do that. It's not the route I would want to go down, but it shouldn't be the role of trade agreements to try and lock in these changes. And I know, as the Minister would know, that in the US Congress there's been considerable criticism of the Trump administration for using trade agreements in this way to try and set domestic policy in this area, and that should rightly be the role of parliaments to do that and not through trade agreements. I know the Minister knows that I've raised this with him and said that I would have a concern that if the current US proposals for a US-UK trade agreement were accepted, then that would mean we would also have to take this on board, which would massively restrict our ability to legislate on things like online harms. It would potentially undermine things like the age-appropriate design code to protect children online. I know that's not what the Minister wants, and I know the government have resisted those efforts, and I hope that President-elect Biden's administration will review the terms that have been offered by the American government in terms of that trade agreement and change them. But I just want to raise this today because I know the government's intention is clear to make sure that we keep high levels of data protection, and that any changes to our data protection laws should be something that Parliament votes and legislates on. But there are forces at work that want to use trade agreements to try and change the global norms, and we don't really have a global system for monitoring and policing the movement of use of citizens' data. Data is really the kind of new oil of the economy, and therefore it's really important that people know what their rights are and how they can be enforced around the world, and know that trade agreements do not affect that. Thank you.